ministries. He began to go to the major cities. He went to Chicago. He went to Oklahoma City. He went to Los Angeles, to Pasadena. He went to Houston. I have a friend, his name's Joe Foss. His father fell under a truck when he was 8 years old throwing papers. He fell under a truck in the streets of Houston, and a truck ran over him right there in the streets. They took him to Raymond T. Ritchie's Evangelistic Temple, which is just down the street, and God instantaneously healed him. And Milton Foss became a mighty preacher of the gospel. His sons are preachers of the gospel. His grandsons are the preachers of the gospel. His granddaughters are preachers of the gospel. I'm telling you right now, there's always heroes for our heroes. A.C. Lane, this great evangelical preacher, was preaching and he lost his voice. He couldn't talk. There was no voice. His voice was gone. He could not speak. How can you preach if you cannot speak? They told him he had to go and he had to just be sequestered and be alone. He went to a Raymond T. Ritchie evangelistic meeting in Fort Worth, Texas, and God healed him instantaneously in that meeting and gave him his voice back. It was Raymond T. Ritchie that had prayed for him. And then A.C. Lane moved to the city where my father-in-law lived, there in Texas. And that was the church that my father-in-law walked into when they were having a red hot revival meeting. And he went down to the altar, an alcoholic, and he got saved. And he met that girl and married her, and she became my mother-in-law. I'm going to tell you right now, there's a real need for you to understand this. My heroes had heroes. My father-in-law then wanted to go to Bible college. So it was in the late 1930s, and he went to the Bible college there in Houston, Texas, at Evangelistic Temple that Raymond T. Ritchie was the pastor of, and his brother and his father. And they were broke. I mean, they didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. He said, if steamboats cost a nickel, I wouldn't have enough money to buy the steam of the whistle. And so he's discouraged and he's broke. The blue birds of discouragement had come in on him. And so my father-in-law got up real early one morning. He was fasting and praying because they didn't have anything to eat. It's one thing to fast because you're fasting. It's another thing to fast when you don't have anything to eat anyway. And he was in the shadows of the altar at Evangelistic Temple early one morning before the sun came up. And he was praying. He was crying out to God. He was crying. He was broken. And as he was praying, Raymond T. Ritchie just happened to walk through that sanctuary. And he knew Hardy. And he walked through the sanctuary and he saw him crying out to God and begging God to do something in his life. He said, Raymond T. Ritchie walked by on his way out of the building to go to another city to preach a crusade, slapped me on the back and said, cheer up, brother. He said, I cheered up for the next 35 years. Y'all hear what I said? That's a true story. That's a result of what happened from one touch of a man of God who had faith. He said, I cheered up for the next 35 years. Some of you need to cheer up, brother. Cheer up, sister. Act like God's on the throne and you don't have anything to do with it and your burden can't pull him down. My God in heaven, I feel the presence of God tonight. Just thinking about my heroes had heroes. They weren't just heroic, they were righteous men that inspired a generation before me. And their heroes didn't live as their shields of faith were not anointed with oil. They lived as though their shield of faith was anointed with oil. They were like Eleazar, David's mighty man, who slew the Philistines one day until his hand grew weary and he clave unto the sword. In Bakersfield, California, there was a pastor of First Assembly of God Church that was getting ready to preach on a Sunday morning. I heard Everett Stenhouse tell this story years later, who was the pastor of that church. Sam Ward pastored that church. This pastor was getting ready and shaved on a Sunday morning, and he went in to get ready to put on his clothes, and all of a sudden he was stricken with a heart attack. And his Bible was right there on the nightstand. And when they found him, he was dead, and he had his Bible in his hand. The coroner came, And they did everything they could to pry the Bible out of his hand, and they could not pry the Bible out of his hand, because his hand grew weary and he clave unto the sword. You need to cleave to the Word of God. That's what these righteous men of another day, that's what they were like. That's what made them different. And I thought about that. I thought, Raymond T. Ritchie, they wrote an autobiography about him. I recommend you try to find it. What God has wrought. What God has wrought. How many of you can look at your life right now and say, look what God has wrought? I'm going to tell you right now, I can say, look what God has wrought. Among other things, heroes are defenders. And that's what these men were. They were defenders of the faith. And men of faith were attracted to them. On my father-in-law's tombstone, there's an epitaph, my hero. I saw to it that it was put there because he asked for us to put it on his tombstone. And engraved like the character that was engraved in his life, it said, they served their generation by the will of God. Heroes serve their generation by the will of God. They don't serve their own pleasures. They don't serve a moment of satisfaction. They don't serve themselves. There's something unique and wonderful about them. I can tell you, Raymond T. Ritchie, he died, and when he died, he was living in an apartment there adjacent to Evangelistic Temple. But before that, he lived in an apartment complex that's like this one down here on the right side, just across the interstate. It was nothing. It was low rent. This guy that went into cities and would rent buildings that had 5,000 and 10,000 seats and fill them up month after month after month during the 20s and 30s, during the hardest time that America was ever going to face. I'm telling you right now, that's the time for the heroes to rise up. The book of Psalms says, who will rise up in this evil day? Who will rise up for him?